In this lecture, we are going to be doing an overview of the nervous system, covering the neuron types and the structure of neurons. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to define nerve, neuron, peripheral and central nervous system, somatic and autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, axon, dendrite, synapse, and neurotransmitter. Be able to compare different types of neurons, being sensory, inter, and motor neurons. List the cranial and spinal nerves, and the depth to which we'll be testing this may depend on what semester this is. Be able to label the parts of a neuron. That last objective is not something we're going to do in this lecture, but will be in the next one. So the central nervous system is what we think of when we think of the brain and the spinal cord. But that's just one component of the nervous system in general. And the nervous system governs how we sense and react to our external environment. Less of a homeostasis question and more of a stimulus response type question. Nervous tissue, as we defined it earlier, is neurons, which are cells capable of transmitting electrical impulses, and the other cells that are going to be helping the neurons do their job. You see those neurons in orange here and the other cells in green. The central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. These are the parts of the nervous system that are found in the axial skeleton, if you wanted to relate it to the skeleton. I mean, not the ribs, but the rest of the axial skeleton. The peripheral nervous system is literally everything else. So the peripheral nervous system can be found outside of the brain and spinal cord. So we're going to look at both of these in this lecture today. We can further divide parts of the peripheral nervous system into the sensory and motor. So the sensory is going to be taking things from the external environment, from the internal environment, and from various changes in your internal and external environments, and allowing you to process that in the central nervous system, which will then give a response. And that's going to be your motor, your output. So we have there the somatic and autonomic nervous system divisions. So somatic is your control of skeletal muscle. So we saw earlier how nerves can interact with muscles. That's the somatic division. And that is specifically skeletal muscles, not smooth muscles. If you want to think smooth muscle, you're thinking the autonomic division of the peripheral nervous system, which controls smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and various glands. We will, later in this lecture, further divide that into the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. Now, here's a term I want you guys to know. There are nerves and there are neurons. An individual cell is a neuron. A bundle of neurons found together is what we call a nerve. And you're going to see nerves generally as these white threads. And that's actually the axons of several neurons that have been put together. So when we refer to nerves later in this lecture, it's really those axons that are traveling from one point to another, and those are bundled neurons. So let's look at the types of neurons. First off, we have sensory neurons. They're specialized to feel a specific stimulus. Your skin is full of these, and there are several types we're going to cover in the next slide. Interneurons integrate information from sensory neurons and coordinate a response. So that's what your central nervous system is going to be made of. You have a lot of interneurons coordinating responses. And last off are the motor neurons. They carry orders to muscle tissue or other organs in response to stimulus. And we saw that those can be your somatic or autonomic division. So your motor neurons are going to be responding to things. And there are different types of sensory neurons. Each neuron is specialized to sense a different type of stimulus. We have heat sensing, cold sensing, pressure sensing, and pain sensing. So these will detect different things, and damage to one may cause you to be unable to detect one type of stimulus, but still perfectly able to detect other types of stimuli. The reflex arc is a good way of looking at how these neurons interact with one another. So let's say you have a painful stimulus applied to the right foot. This would be our pain sensing neurons that are going to sense that. And these sensory neurons are going to carry a signal to the spinal cord. They're going to tell the spinal cord that this person is walking on broken glass. Their interneurons are going to coordinate a response because this response needs to be twofold. First off, a motor neuron has to cause the flexor reflex withdrawing the right leg. But this alone would just mean the right leg would go up and the left leg would probably not do anything and you'd fall over. So what happens is there is another interneuron stimulating the motor neurons on the other side to extend the left leg. So the right leg is withdrawn and the left leg is extended. So we can see that the interaction between the peripheral nervous system via sensory neurons and the central nervous system via interneurons causes a reaction in the peripheral nervous system of the motor neurons. And this knee-jerk reaction is relatively complicated, but does not need to involve the brain, just the spinal cord. So the reflex arc often goes through the spinal cord. The autonomic nervous system is not motor neurons. It's going to be other types of neurons that are going to be innervating smooth muscle, glands, and other organs. And these can be divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. We're familiar with the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight or freeze response. That is generally in regards to a threat. The pupils dilate, the heart rate increases, and digestion will stop. Alternately, you have the parasympathetic nervous system. If you are currently listening to this lecture while sitting in a nice chair and sipping some pleasant warm tea, you are currently in the rest and digest state. Some of you may fall asleep during my lectures, and that is because I am activating the parasympathetic nervous system. If I wanted to, I could yell really loudly and activate the sympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system is going to increase salivation, decrease the heart rate, and stimulate digestion. And these two work kind of opposing to one another, and you can see the different interactions here of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Now, it's not that all of this will occur at once. For example, just because you're resting and digesting doesn't automatically mean that you're also defecating. That's a lot going on, but it would be more likely that that is going to be occurring. And you can see that there are some different neurons here. You see cranial nerves, thoracic nerves, cervical nerves, lumbar nerves, and sacral nerves that are all part of this parasympathetic nervous system and sympathetic nervous system. And these are all coming off and they're part of the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is including both of these divisions. Let's look at the cranial nerves. Just as the spinal cord has nerves for parts of the body, the brain too has nerves to go to parts of the body. The olfactory nerve is going to be for smell. And this is actually really important in memory generation in mammals. The trigeminal nerve stimulates 3 parts of the face, so later on divides up and helps people chew and various other things. Its facial nerves are going to be actually stimulating the muscles of the face. Glossopharyngeal nerves are stimulating the mouth and stimulating swallowing. Optic nerves are for the eyes. The trochlear nerves are specific to eye movements. And the vagus nerve is not stimulating something in the head. That's actually for digestion. These are the various cranial nerves that come off of the brain. The spinal nerves, which you saw earlier in the sympathetic nervous system, let's go back up there. You see how the cranial nerves can be dilating pupils and increasing salivation or decreasing salivation. And even you see stimulation of digestive processes coming off of some cranial nerves. So too with the spinal nerves stimulating things. And there are 4 different types of these. We have cervical nerves, which are coming from cervical vertebrae. We have thoracic nerves, which come out of the thoracic vertebrae. The lumbar nerves come out of the lumbar vertebrae. The sacral nerves come out of the sacrum down here. And then we have the coccygeal nerve, which we're not really covering here. So just look at these 4 types of spinal nerve. Last, let's look at the various components of a neuron. So this is going to be very important in the next lecture when we talk about action potentials and how they are created. First off are the dendrites, and these are extensions that are going to receive input. So we see these in the sensory neurons, that the dendrites are receiving inputs for pain. The cell body is going to be integrating the input and coordinating the responses. This is also containing the nucleus and most organelles. We can see the cell body in the interneuron is going to be actually poked by the axons and synapses of the sensory neuron. More on those in a moment. You can see the cell body of the sensory neurons actually somewhat apart from where the impulse goes and just coordinates things. It's a sensory neurons don't need to do much integration. Interneurons need to do integration. And then we have the axon, which is going to be long and transmits impulses to other neurons or some organ. We can see this one motor neuron here actually has its cell body in the presence of where the interneurons are, but this long motor neuron is going to have a long axon that will go out to the muscle. And that's what we'd see a lot of those axons bundled together. Those are the axons of motor neurons that are going to be sending the stimulus out to something else. At the end of that axon are synapses, and those are the tips of the axon terminal, and they release neurotransmitters. Much more on that in another lecture.